Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that spans over 3,000 years, through the sands of time to a civilization that has captivated humanity for millennia. This is the complete story of ancient Egypt, from the first stirrings of life along the Nile to the final breath of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh to rule the land of the pyramids. It's a tale of god-kings and humble farmers, of monuments that scrape the sky and tombs that burrow deep into the earth, of a people so obsessed with the afterlife that they turned death into an art form. We'll witness the rise and fall of dynasties, the construction of wonders that still baffle engineers today, and the daily lives of people who believed their pharaoh was literally a living god. If this kind of deep historical exploration helps you unwind after a long day, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about exploring ancient mysteries while the modern world sleeps around us. So settle in, let the day's worries fade away, and let's begin this epic journey through the entire history of ancient Egyptian civilization. From the pre-dynastic villages along the Nile to the Roman conquest that ended 3 millennia of pharaonic rule, we'll explore every dynasty, every triumph, every catastrophe that shaped this remarkable civilization. Before there were pharaohs, before there were pyramids, before there was even the concept of Egypt as we know it, there was the river. The Nile, that great serpent of water that winds its way through the heart of Africa, was the single most important factor in creating one of history's most enduring civilizations. To understand ancient Egypt, you must first understand the Nile. It's not just a river, it's a lifeline, a calendar, a god, and a highway all rolled into one. Without the Nile, Egypt would be nothing more than an extension of the Sahara Desert, endless sand dunes stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and he wasn't being poetic. He was stating a geological fact. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood, depositing rich black silt across the river valley. This annual inundation transformed a narrow strip of desert into the most fertile agricultural land in the ancient world. Picture this. You're standing on the edge of the Nile Valley around 6,000 years ago. To your east and west stretch endless expanses of sand and rock, baked by a sun so fierce it could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. But here, along the river, the land is green and lush. Palm trees sway in the breeze, birds call from the reeds, and the air is thick with the promise of life. The people who first settled along the Nile weren't Egyptians yet. That identity would take millennia to develop. They were nomadic tribes who had been pushed toward the river by the gradual desiccation of the Sahara. Around 8,000 years ago, what is now the world's largest desert was actually a green savanna, dotted with lakes and crossed by rivers. But as the climate changed, these early peoples were forced to abandon their traditional hunting grounds and cluster around the one reliable source of water, the Nile. At first, these settlements were small and scattered. Archaeological evidence from sites like Nabta Playa shows us communities of hunter-gatherers who were just beginning to experiment with agriculture. They built simple stone circles, some of the world's earliest astronomical observatories, to track the movements of the stars and predict the annual flood. The flood was everything. It usually began in July when the summer rains in the Ethiopian highlands swelled the Blue Nile, which joined the White Nile at modern-day Khartoum. The combined waters would surge northward, reaching the first cataract at Aswan by late July or early August. From there, the flood would spread across the valley, turning the entire landscape into a vast, shallow lake. For 3 months, the land would remain underwater. Then, as the flood receded, it would leave behind a layer of rich, black mud, so fertile that farmers could grow crops with minimal effort. The Egyptians called this black earth Kemet, which became one of their names for their country. To them, the annual miracle of the flood was proof that the gods favored their land above all others. But the Nile was more than just a source of water and fertile soil. It was also Egypt's highway. The river flows from south to north, but the prevailing winds blow from north to south. This meant that boats could sail upstream with the wind and drift downstream with the current. It was a transportation system so perfect it seemed designed by the gods themselves. As the centuries passed, the scattered settlements along the Nile began to coalesce into larger communities. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, and cities into kingdoms. By around 4,000 years before the Common Era, two distinct cultures had emerged: Upper Egypt in the south, centered around the city of Hierakonpolis, and Lower Egypt in the north, centered in the Nile Delta. These weren't just geographical divisions, they were cultural and political ones as well. Upper Egypt was more conservative, more tied to ancient traditions. Its symbol was the white crown, and its patron goddess was Nekhbet, the vulture. Lower Egypt was more cosmopolitan, more open to foreign influences. Its symbol was the red crown, and its patron goddess was Wadjet, the cobra. For centuries, these two kingdoms existed side by side, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, but always separate. Their art styles were different, their religious practices varied, and their political systems evolved along different lines. It seemed as though Egypt might remain forever divided. But around 3,100 years before the Common Era, everything changed. A king from Upper Egypt, his name was probably Narmer, though some sources call him Menes, launched a campaign to unite the two lands under a single crown. The details of this conquest are lost to history, but its results were profound. For the first time, the entire length of the Nile Valley from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean Sea was under unified rule. The unification of Egypt wasn't just a political event, it was a cultural revolution. The new pharaoh, a word that originally meant great house, referring to the royal palace, wore both crowns, symbolizing his rule over both lands. He established a new capital at Memphis, strategically located at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt. Most importantly, he created a new ideology of kingship that would endure for 3,000 years. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a god. Specifically, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity who was the son of Osiris, the god of the dead. When the pharaoh died, he became Osiris himself, ruling over the afterlife while his successor took on the role of Horus. This divine kingship gave the pharaoh absolute authority over his subjects and provided the ideological foundation for one of history's most stable political systems. But even as Egypt was being unified politically, its culture was being shaped by the rhythm of the Nile. The annual flood created a natural calendar that divided the year into 3 seasons: Akhet, the inundation; Pere, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. This agricultural cycle became the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, influencing everything from religious festivals to administrative practices. The flood also created a unique relationship between the Egyptians and their environment. Unlike other ancient peoples who often saw nature as hostile and unpredictable, the Egyptians viewed their world as fundamentally benevolent. The Nile provided for them year after year with clockwork regularity. The sun rose and set with perfect consistency. Even death, in the Egyptian worldview, was not an ending, but a transformation. A journey to an afterlife that was essentially an idealized version of life along the Nile. This optimistic worldview would shape Egyptian culture for millennia. It explains their obsession with order and stability, their elaborate preparations for the afterlife, and their confidence in the divine nature of their pharaoh. The Nile had given them not just life, but a way of understanding life that would prove remarkably enduring. As we stand at the beginning of Egyptian history, watching the first pharaoh place the double crown upon his head, we can already see the seeds of everything that would follow. The pyramids, the mummies, the golden treasures, the mighty armies. All of it grew from this moment when the gift of the Nile was first united under a single divine ruler. The river that had nurtured scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers had become the backbone of a civilization that would endure longer than any other in human history. The gift of the Nile was about to become the wonder of the world. If you've ever wondered when ancient Egypt truly became ancient Egypt, when it transformed from a collection of Nile Valley settlements into the civilization that still captures our imagination today, the answer lies in the Old Kingdom, roughly 2,700 to 2,200 years before the Common Era. This was the age when pharaohs became gods, when stone replaced mud brick, and when the Egyptians built monuments so magnificent that they're still considered wonders of the world today. The Old Kingdom began with the Third Dynasty, around 2,680 years before the Common Era, when a pharaoh named Djoser decided that the traditional mud-brick mastaba tombs of his predecessors simply weren't impressive enough for a god-king. He commissioned his architect, a brilliant man named Imhotep, to design something unprecedented, a tomb that would literally reach toward the heavens. What Imhotep created at Saqqara was revolutionary. The Step Pyramid, the world's first monumental stone building. It wasn't built all at once. Rather, it evolved from a traditional mastaba that was expanded upward in 6 distinct steps, reaching a height of over 200 feet. The pyramid was surrounded by a vast complex of courtyards, chapels, and ceremonial buildings, all enclosed within a wall that stretched for over a mile. But the Step Pyramid was more than just an impressive tomb. It was a statement. It announced to the world that Egypt had entered a new age, an age when pharaohs commanded resources so vast that they could literally move mountains. The pyramid required thousands of workers, millions of stone blocks, and decades of labor. It was a project that could only be undertaken by a civilization that had achieved unprecedented levels of organization, wealth, and technical skill. Imhotep himself became a legend. He was not just an architect, but also a physician, a priest, and a scholar. Later generations would deify him, worshiping him as a god of medicine and wisdom. He represents the emergence of a new class of educated professionals who would become the backbone of Egyptian administration, the scribes, engineers, and officials who made the pharaoh's divine will manifest in the physical world. The success of Djoser's pyramid inspired his successors to even greater ambitions. The Fourth Dynasty, which began around 2,600 years before the Common Era, would produce the most famous monuments in human history, the Pyramids of Giza. The first of these was built by Pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. The Great Pyramid, as it came to be called, was a project of staggering ambition. It originally stood 481 feet tall, making it the tallest building in the world for over 3,800 years. It contains approximately 2,300,000 stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. To put this in perspective, imagine trying to build the Great Pyramid today. You would need to quarry, transport, and precisely position one block every 2 minutes, working 24 hours a day for 20 years. And this was accomplished with copper tools, wooden sledges, and human muscle power. No cranes, no bulldozers, no modern machinery of any kind. The precision of the Great Pyramid is equally astounding. Its base is level to within just 2.1 centimeters. Its sides are aligned to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. The pyramid's slope angle of 51 degrees and 52 minutes creates a perfect mathematical relationship between its height and base circumference. This wasn't just engineering, it was sacred geometry made manifest in stone. But how did they do it? This question has puzzled historians and engineers for centuries. We know they used ramps, probably a combination of straight ramps and spiral ramps that wound around the pyramid as it rose. We know they used copper tools, wooden levers, and rope to move the massive blocks. We know they had a workforce of probably 20,000 to 30,000 people, including skilled craftsmen, laborers, and support staff. What's remarkable is that this workforce wasn't composed of slaves, as Hollywood movies would have you believe. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed the remains of workers' villages near the pyramids, complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. The workers were well fed, receiving daily rations of bread, beer, onions, and garlic. They were organized into crews with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkor, suggesting a sense of pride and camaraderie in their work. These workers were participating in something they understood to be sacred. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a machine for resurrection, a device designed to transform the dead pharaoh into a god and ensure his eternal rule over Egypt. Every block they placed, every corridor they carved, every chamber they constructed was part of a cosmic plan to maintain the divine order that kept Egypt prosperous and secure. The Great Pyramid was followed by 2 others at Giza, the Pyramid of Khafra, Khufu's son, and the Pyramid of Menkaure, Khafra's successor. Together with the Great Sphinx, that enigmatic guardian with a human head and a lion's body, they created a necropolis that served as the eternal home of Egypt's god-kings. The Sphinx itself is a mystery wrapped in an enigma. Carved from a single piece of limestone, it's 240 feet long and 66 feet high. Its face, weathered by millennia of wind and sand, is believed to represent Pharaoh Khafra, though some theories suggest it might be much older. The Sphinx has been buried and excavated multiple times throughout history, and it continues to guard its secrets jealously. But the pyramids of Giza were just the culmination of a pyramid-building tradition that spanned the entire Old Kingdom. Pharaohs built pyramids at Saqqara, Dahshur, Meidum, and Abu Sir. Each one was a unique experiment in architecture and engineering, as the Egyptians refined their techniques and pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The bent pyramid at Dahshur, built by Pharaoh Sneferu, shows the Egyptians learning from their mistakes. The pyramid's angle changes halfway up, creating its distinctive bent appearance. This was probably because the original angle was too steep, and the pyramid was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Rather than start over, the builders simply changed the angle and continued upward, a pragmatic solution that created one of Egypt's most distinctive monuments. The Red Pyramid, also built by Sneferu, represents the perfection of pyramid-building technique. It was the first true pyramid, smooth-sided and geometrically perfect. It served as the prototype for the Great Pyramid and demonstrated that the Egyptians had mastered the art of building in stone on a colossal scale. But the Old Kingdom was about more than just pyramids. This was also the age when Egyptian art, literature, and culture reached their first great flowering. The walls of Old Kingdom tombs are covered with scenes of daily life, so detailed and vivid that they serve as windows into a world that vanished 4,000 years ago. We see farmers plowing fields and harvesting grain, fishermen casting nets in the Nile, craftsmen working gold and copper, scribes recording transactions, and nobles enjoying elaborate banquets. These scenes weren't just decorative, they were magical, designed to ensure that the deceased would enjoy all the pleasures of earthly life in the afterlife. The Old Kingdom also saw the development of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing into a sophisticated system capable of recording everything from royal decrees to love poetry. The pyramid texts, carved into the walls of later Old Kingdom pyramids, are among the oldest religious writings in the world. They provide our first detailed glimpse into Egyptian beliefs about death, resurrection, and the afterlife. These texts reveal a complex mythology centered around the god Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Set, dismembered, and then resurrected by his wife Isis. The pharaoh, in death, became Osiris, while his successor became Horus, Osiris's son. This myth provided the theological foundation for Egyptian kingship and explained how divine authority was passed from one pharaoh to the next. The Old Kingdom pharaohs ruled from Memphis, a city that stood at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis was more than just a capital. It was a sacred city, home to the god Ptah, who was believed to have created the world through the power of his spoken word. The city's temples, palaces, and administrative buildings made it one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Old Kingdom was its stability. For over 500 years, Egypt enjoyed an unprecedented period of peace, prosperity, and cultural achievement. The pharaoh's divine authority was unquestioned, the Nile flooded reliably each year, and Egypt's borders were secure from foreign invasion. This stability was built on a sophisticated administrative system that the Egyptians called Ma'at, a concept that encompassed truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. Ma'at wasn't just a legal principle, it was a religious obligation. The pharaoh was responsible for maintaining Ma'at throughout his kingdom, ensuring that the cosmic order that kept the Nile flooding and the sun rising was preserved for all eternity. The administration of this divine order required an army of officials, scribes, and bureaucrats. Egypt was divided into administrative districts called nomes, each governed by a nomarch who answered directly to the pharaoh. These officials collected taxes, organized labor gangs for public works projects, maintained irrigation systems, and ensured that the pharaoh's will was carried out in every corner of the kingdom. The wealth that flowed into the royal treasury from this efficient administration was staggering. Egypt controlled the trade routes between Africa and the Mediterranean, exporting gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals in exchange for cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The pharaoh's workshops produced luxury goods of unparalleled quality, jewelry, furniture, weapons, and ceremonial objects that demonstrated Egyptian craftsmanship to the world. But this golden age couldn't last forever. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2,180 years before the Common Era, cracks were beginning to appear in the Old Kingdom's seemingly perfect facade. The last great pharaoh of the period was Pepi II, who ruled for an astonishing 94 years, the longest reign in Egyptian history. Pepi II's extraordinarily long reign, while initially a sign of stability, eventually became a source of weakness. As the pharaoh aged, his authority began to wane. The nomarchs, who had grown wealthy and powerful during the prosperous years of the Old Kingdom, began to assert their independence. Local governors started building their own armies, establishing their own trade relationships, and even conducting their own foreign policy. At the same time, Egypt was facing environmental challenges that would test the resilience of its civilization. The annual Nile flood, which had been so reliable for centuries, began to fail. A series of low floods, probably caused by climate change in the Ethiopian highlands, led to widespread famine and social unrest. The carefully maintained irrigation systems fell into disrepair, and agricultural production plummeted. The combination of political fragmentation and environmental crisis proved too much for the Old Kingdom to survive. When Pepi II finally died around 2,184 years before the Common Era, Egypt collapsed into chaos. The central government lost control, the nomarchs declared independence, and the unified kingdom that had endured for over 800 years shattered into competing factions. This collapse marked the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a dark age of civil war, famine, and social upheaval that would last for over 150 years. The pyramids still stood, silent monuments to a golden age that seemed as distant as a dream, but the civilization that had built them appeared to be dying. Yet even in its collapse, the Old Kingdom had established patterns and precedents that would shape Egyptian civilization for the next 2.5 millennia. The concept of divine kingship, the administrative system based on nomes, the artistic and architectural styles, the religious beliefs centered on Osiris and the afterlife, all of these would survive the chaos of the First Intermediate Period and be revived by later dynasties. The pyramids themselves became symbols of Egypt's eternal nature. Long after the pharaohs who built them were forgotten, the pyramids continued to inspire awe and wonder. They reminded later generations of Egyptians that their ancestors had once achieved greatness, and they could do so again. In a very real sense, the pyramids became Egypt's promise to itself, a stone testament to the belief that what had been built once could be built again. As we watch the Old Kingdom fade into history, we can see that it had accomplished something remarkable. In the space of 5 centuries, a collection of Nile Valley settlements had transformed itself into a civilization capable of building monuments that would outlast empires. The Egyptians had learned to work stone on a massive scale, to organize labor forces numbering in the tens of thousands, and to create art and literature that would influence human culture for millennia. Most importantly, they had created an idea of Egypt, a vision of a land blessed by the gods, ruled by divine kings, and destined for eternal greatness. This idea would prove more durable than any pyramid, more enduring than any dynasty. It would survive conquest and collapse, foreign rule and civil war, carrying the essence of Egyptian civilization through 3,000 years of history. The Old Kingdom was over, but Egypt was just beginning. The collapse of the Old Kingdom around 2,180 years before the Common Era plunged Egypt into one of the darkest periods in its long history. The First Intermediate Period lasting roughly from 2180 to 2050 years before the Common Era, was a time when the very foundations of Egyptian civilization seemed to crumble. Imagine waking up one morning to find that everything you had taken for granted, the authority of the pharaoh, the reliability of the Nile flood, the prosperity of your village, the security of your borders, had simply vanished overnight. This was the reality for Egyptians living through the First Intermediate Period, a time so traumatic that it would be remembered in Egyptian literature for centuries as the ultimate cautionary tale about what happens when Ma'at, divine order, breaks down. The immediate cause of the collapse was the death of Pepi II after his 94-year reign, but the underlying problems had been building for decades. The pharaoh's authority had been gradually eroding as local governors, the nomarchs, accumulated wealth and power. These provincial rulers had begun to see themselves not as servants of the pharaoh, but as independent kings in their own right. When Pepi II died, there was no strong successor to hold the kingdom together. The 7th and 8th dynasties, ruling from Memphis, were little more than shadows of their old kingdom predecessors. Ancient sources speak of 70 kings ruling for 70 days, probably an exaggeration, but one that captures the chaos and instability of the period. Meanwhile, the nomarchs were carving up Egypt among themselves. The country fragmented into dozens of competing kingdoms, each centered on a major city and its surrounding territory. These petty kings fought constantly among themselves, turning the Nile Valley into a patchwork of warring states. Trade collapsed, the irrigation systems fell into disrepair, and the careful administrative structure that had made the Old Kingdom possible simply disintegrated. But the political chaos was only part of the story. Egypt was also facing an environmental catastrophe that would test the resilience of its civilization. The Nile, which had flooded reliably for centuries, began to fail. A series of exceptionally low floods, probably caused by climate change in the Ethiopian highlands where the Blue Nile originates, led to widespread famine. The ancient texts describe the horror of these years in vivid detail. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, a literary work that may date from this period, paints a picture of a world turned upside down. The land turns around as does a potter's wheel. Servants have become masters. The poor man has become wealthy. The children of nobles are dashed against the walls. Another text, the Prophecy of Neferti, describes Egypt as a land where the river of Egypt is empty. Men cross over the water on foot. The land is diminished. Its rulers are increased. It is bare, but its taxes are great. The sun is veiled and will not shine. No one can live when the sun is veiled by clouds. These weren't just literary metaphors, they were descriptions of real conditions. Archaeological evidence from this period shows clear signs of malnutrition, social upheaval, and economic collapse. Cemeteries reveal that life expectancy dropped dramatically, and many settlements were simply abandoned as people fled in search of food and security. The breakdown of central authority also led to a cultural revolution of sorts. For centuries, the pharaoh had been the sole intermediary between the gods and humanity. Only the pharaoh could ensure that the dead were properly prepared for the afterlife. Only the pharaoh could maintain the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous. But with the pharaoh's authority in question, ordinary Egyptians began to take matters into their own hands. This period saw what scholars call the democratization of the afterlife. Spells and rituals that had once been reserved for the pharaoh alone began appearing in the tombs of ordinary nobles and officials. The coffin texts, painted on the inside of wooden coffins, gave middle-class Egyptians access to the magical knowledge they needed to navigate the afterlife successfully. This wasn't just a religious change, it was a social revolution. The rigid hierarchy of the Old Kingdom, with the divine pharaoh at its apex, was being challenged by a more egalitarian worldview. If the pharaoh couldn't guarantee prosperity in this life or salvation in the next, then perhaps ordinary people needed to look out for themselves. Yet, even in the midst of this chaos, the seeds of renewal were being planted. In the south, in the city of Thebes, a family of local rulers was slowly building a power base that would eventually reunite Egypt. These Theban princes, who would become the 11th dynasty, understood that Egypt's problems couldn't be solved through military conquest alone. They needed to restore the people's faith in the divine order that had made Egypt great. The process of reunification began around 2060 years before the Common Era, when a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II launched a campaign to bring all of Egypt under his control. It took him nearly 50 years, but by 2010 years before the Common Era, he had succeeded in reuniting Upper and Lower Egypt under a single crown. Mentuhotep II's victory marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, but it was more than just a military triumph. It was a cultural and spiritual renewal. The new pharaoh understood that he needed to rebuild not just Egypt's political unity, but also its confidence in itself. He launched massive building projects, restored the irrigation systems, and revived the artistic and literary traditions that had flourished during the Old Kingdom. But the Middle Kingdom pharaohs also learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They created a more centralized administrative system, reducing the power of the nomarchs and ensuring that local governors remained loyal to the crown. They also developed a more sophisticated understanding of Egypt's place in the wider world, establishing trade relationships with Nubia, the Levant, and the Aegean. Perhaps most importantly, they created a new ideology of kingship that acknowledged the lessons of the First Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs didn't claim to be infallible gods. They presented themselves as shepherds of their people, responsible for their welfare and accountable for their failures. This more humble approach to divine kingship would prove more durable than the absolute authority claimed by the Old Kingdom pharaohs. The literature of the Middle Kingdom reflects this new understanding of royal responsibility. The instructions of Amenemhat II warns future pharaohs about the dangers of trusting their subordinates. Trust not a brother, know not a friend, make not for yourself intimates, it is worthless. The Tale of Sinuhe explores themes of exile and return, reflecting the period's preoccupation with the fragility of social order. These texts reveal a civilization that had been traumatized by its experience of collapse but had emerged stronger and wiser. The Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom understood that their civilization was not guaranteed by divine favor alone. It required constant vigilance, careful administration, and the active participation of all levels of society. The First Intermediate Period had been a time of darkness and despair, but it had also been a time of learning and growth. The Egyptians had discovered that their civilization was more resilient than they had imagined. Even when the pharaoh's authority collapsed, even when the Nile failed to flood, even when the very foundations of their world seemed to crumble, the essential spirit of Egypt endured. The pyramids still stood on the Giza plateau, weathered but unbroken, reminding the Egyptians of their ancestors' achievements. The hieroglyphic script still preserved their sacred texts, keeping alive the wisdom of ages past. The Nile still flowed from south to north, carrying the promise of renewal with each annual flood. Most importantly, the idea of Egypt, the vision of a land blessed by the gods and destined for greatness, had survived the chaos. This idea would be refined and strengthened during the Middle Kingdom, creating a more mature and sophisticated understanding of what it meant to be Egyptian. The First Intermediate Period had ended, but its lessons would never be forgotten. The Egyptians had learned that civilization is fragile, that prosperity is temporary, and that even divine kings are mortal. But they had also learned that with wisdom, courage, and determination, even the greatest disasters can be overcome. The Dark Age was over. The Middle Kingdom was about to begin. The reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II, around 2010 years before the Common Era, marked the beginning of what many scholars consider the classical age of Egyptian civilization. The Middle Kingdom, lasting from approximately 2050 to 1650 years before the Common Era, was a time when Egypt achieved a remarkable balance between the divine authority of the pharaoh and the practical needs of governing a complex society. If the Old Kingdom had been about establishing the fundamental patterns of Egyptian civilization, and the First Intermediate Period had been about testing those patterns to their breaking point, then the Middle Kingdom was about refining and perfecting them. This was Egypt at its most sophisticated, most self-aware, and in many ways, most human. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They understood that absolute power, unchecked by wisdom or restraint, could lead to the kind of collapse that had ended the Old Kingdom. Instead of claiming to be infallible gods, they presented themselves as shepherds of their people, responsible for Egypt's welfare and accountable for its failures. This new approach to kingship is beautifully illustrated in the literature of the period. The instructions of Amenemhat, written as advice from a dead pharaoh to his son, reveals a ruler who had learned hard lessons about the nature of power. I gave to the beggar and nourished the orphan. I caused him who was nothing to reach the goal, like him who was somebody. But he who ate my food raised opposition. He whom I gave my trust used it to plot. These weren't the words of a distant divine king, but of a human ruler who had experienced betrayal, disappointment, and the weight of responsibility. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs understood that kingship was not just a privilege, but a burden, not just an honor, but a duty. This more nuanced understanding of royal authority was reflected in the administrative reforms of the Middle Kingdom. The pharaohs created a more centralized government, reducing the power of the nomarchs who had caused so much trouble during the First Intermediate period. They established a professional civil service, with scribes and officials who were promoted based on merit rather than birth. The capital was moved from Memphis to a new city called Itje-Tawi, located near modern-day Lisht. This new capital was strategically positioned to control both Upper and Lower Egypt, and its very name, meaning Caesar of the two lands, announced the pharaoh's determination to maintain unity at all costs. But the Middle Kingdom pharaohs didn't just focus on internal administration, they also turned their attention to Egypt's borders. For the first time in Egyptian history, the pharaohs began to think systematically about defense and expansion. They built a series of massive fortresses along the southern border with Nubia, creating what was essentially an ancient version of the Great Wall of China. These fortresses, with names like Buhan, Semna, and Kuma, were marvels of military engineering. They featured massive walls, sophisticated gate systems, and carefully planned fields of fire that could devastate any attacking force. But they weren't just military installations. They were also administrative centers, controlling the flow of trade between Egypt and Nubia, and ensuring that the wealth of the south flowed northward to the pharaoh's treasury. The conquest of Nubia was motivated by more than just military ambition. It was driven by Egypt's insatiable appetite for gold. Nubia was rich in gold deposits, and the Middle Kingdom pharaohs needed this precious metal to fund their building projects, maintain their armies, and demonstrate their wealth to foreign rulers. The gold of Nubia became the foundation of Egypt's prosperity during this period. But the Middle Kingdom pharaohs were also interested in expanding Egypt's influence to the north and east. They established trading relationships with the cities of the Levant, importing cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, and exotic goods from as far away as Afghanistan. Egyptian merchants and diplomats traveled throughout the eastern Mediterranean, spreading Egyptian influence and bringing foreign ideas back to the Nile Valley. This cosmopolitan outlook is reflected in the art and literature of the Middle Kingdom. Egyptian artists began to experiment with new styles and techniques, influenced by contact with foreign cultures. The rigid, formal art of the Old Kingdom gave way to more naturalistic and expressive works. Statues showed pharaohs with careworn faces and realistic features, acknowledging the human burden of divine kingship. The literature of the Middle Kingdom is particularly remarkable for its psychological depth and moral complexity. The tale of Sinuhe, perhaps the greatest work of ancient Egyptian literature, tells the story of a court official who flees Egypt after the assassination of his pharaoh, lives in exile among the Asiatics, and eventually returns home to die in his beloved homeland. The story explores themes of identity, loyalty, and belonging that resonate across cultures and centuries. Another masterpiece, The Eloquent Peasant, tells of a simple farmer who is robbed by a corrupt official and demands justice from the authorities. The peasant's eloquent speeches about justice and righteousness so impress the officials that they delay judgment just to hear more of his beautiful words. The story is both a celebration of the power of eloquence and a critique of a justice system that values style over substance. These literary works reveal a civilization that had achieved remarkable sophistication in its understanding of human nature and social relationships. The Middle Kingdom Egyptians were capable of irony, self-criticism, and psychological insight in ways that their Old Kingdom predecessors had not been. They had learned to question authority, to examine their own motives, and to acknowledge the complexity of moral choices. This intellectual sophistication was matched by remarkable achievements in mathematics, medicine, and engineering. The Rund Papyrus, dating from around 1,650 years before the Common Era, demonstrates that Egyptian mathematicians had developed sophisticated techniques for solving complex problems involving fractions, geometry, and algebra. The Edwin Smith Papyrus reveals that Egyptian physicians had a detailed understanding of anatomy and surgical procedures that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 2,000 years. The engineering achievements of the Middle Kingdom were equally impressive. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, particularly Amenemhat III, undertook massive irrigation projects that transformed the Fayoum oasis into one of Egypt's most productive agricultural regions. They built a complex system of canals and dikes that controlled the flow of water from the Nile, creating what the Greeks would later call Lake Moeris. These irrigation projects required not just engineering skill but also sophisticated administrative coordination. Thousands of workers had to be organized, fed, and housed. Materials had to be transported across hundreds of miles of desert. Local officials had to be coordinated with central planners. The successful completion of these projects demonstrated that the Middle Kingdom had achieved a level of organizational sophistication that rivaled any ancient civilization. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom also revived the pyramid-building tradition, though their pyramids were smaller and less technically ambitious than those of the Old Kingdom. The pyramids at Dashur, built by Amenemhat II and Senusret III, were constructed using a new technique that involved a core of mud brick surrounded by a casing of limestone. This method was more economical than the solid stone construction of the Old Kingdom, reflecting the more practical approach of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs. But perhaps the most significant achievement of the Middle Kingdom was the development of a more inclusive vision of Egyptian society. The democratization of the afterlife that had begun during the First Intermediate Period continued during the Middle Kingdom, with more and more Egyptians gaining access to the spells and rituals that would ensure their survival after death. The coffin texts, painted on the inside of wooden coffins, gave middle-class Egyptians access to magical knowledge that had once been reserved for the pharaoh alone. These texts included maps of the afterlife, spells for overcoming various dangers, and instructions for navigating the complex bureaucracy of the dead. They represented a fundamental shift in Egyptian religious thinking, from a system centered exclusively on the pharaoh to one that acknowledged the spiritual needs of all Egyptians. This religious democratization was accompanied by social changes that gave more Egyptians opportunities for advancement. The professional civil service created by the Middle Kingdom pharaohs was based on merit rather than birth, allowing talented individuals from humble backgrounds to rise to positions of authority. The expansion of trade and industry created new opportunities for merchants and craftsmen. The growth of cities provided alternatives to the traditional agricultural life that had dominated Egypt for millennia. Yet for all its achievements, the Middle Kingdom contained the seeds of its own decline. The very success of the pharaohs in centralizing power and expanding Egypt's borders created new challenges that would eventually prove overwhelming. The cost of maintaining the Nubian fortresses, the complexity of administering an increasingly diverse population, and the growing threat of foreign invasion all placed strains on the system that it was ultimately unable to bear. The first signs of trouble appeared during the reign of Amenemhat IV, around 1,810 years before the Common Era. The pharaoh died without a male heir, and power passed to his sister or daughter, Sobekneferu, who became one of the few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh in her own right. Her reign was brief and troubled, and when she died around 1,806 years before the Common Era, the Middle Kingdom began its slow decline. The 13th dynasty, which followed, was marked by political instability and weak rulers. The centralized administrative system that had been the Middle Kingdom's greatest strength began to break down as local officials asserted their independence. The Nubian fortresses became increasingly difficult to maintain, and Egypt's control over its southern territories began to weaken. At the same time, Egypt was facing new external pressures. Groups of Asiatic peoples, whom the Egyptians called the Hyksos, were migrating into the Nile Delta in increasing numbers. At first, these immigrants were welcomed as traders and craftsmen, but as their numbers grew, they began to challenge Egyptian authority in the north. The Hyksos brought with them new technologies that would revolutionize warfare in the ancient world: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and improved bronze weapons. These innovations gave them a significant military advantage over the Egyptians, who were still fighting with traditional weapons and tactics. By around 1,650 years before the Common Era, the Hyksos had established their own kingdom in the Nile Delta, with their capital at Avaris. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. The Middle Kingdom was over, and Egypt was entering another period of division and foreign domination that historians call the Second Intermediate Period. But the legacy of the Middle Kingdom would endure. The administrative systems, the literary traditions, the artistic styles, and the religious innovations of this period would all be revived and refined by later dynasties. The Middle Kingdom had shown that Egyptian civilization was capable of learning from its mistakes, adapting to new challenges, and emerging stronger from periods of crisis. Most importantly, the Middle Kingdom had created a more mature and sophisticated understanding of what it meant to be Egyptian. The pharaohs of this period had learned to balance divine authority with human responsibility, to combine traditional values with practical innovation, and to create a society that was both stable and dynamic. As the Middle Kingdom faded into history, it left behind a template for Egyptian greatness that would inspire future generations. The Classical Age was over, but its achievements would echo through the centuries, reminding later Egyptians of what their civilization was capable of achieving when it combined wisdom with power, tradition with innovation, and divine authority with human compassion. The Hyksos might rule in the north, but the idea of Egypt, refined and perfected during the Middle Kingdom, remained unbroken in the south, waiting for the right moment to reassert itself and reclaim its rightful place as the greatest civilization in the ancient world. The collapse of the Middle Kingdom around 1,650 years before the Common Era ushered in another period of division and foreign rule that would test Egyptian resilience once again. The Second Intermediate Period, lasting roughly from 1,650 to 1,550 years before the Common Era, was marked by the rise of the Hyksos, foreign rulers who would control northern Egypt for over a century and fundamentally change the nature of Egyptian civilization. The word Hyksos comes from the Egyptian phrase Heka Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. These weren't a single people but rather a confederation of Asiatic groups, Canaanites, Amorites, and others, who had been migrating into the Nile Delta for generations. Initially, they came as traders, craftsmen, and laborers, welcomed by the Egyptians for their skills and exotic goods. But as their numbers grew and Egyptian central authority weakened, they began to assert political control over the regions where they had settled. The rise of the Hyksos was facilitated by their superior military technology. They brought with them innovations that would revolutionize ancient warfare: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, improved bronze weapons, and new siege techniques. The Egyptians, who had relied on traditional infantry tactics for centuries, were simply outmatched by these new military technologies. The psychological impact of the Hyksos conquest was perhaps even greater than the military one. For over 1,000 years, Egyptians had believed that their land was specially blessed by the gods, protected from foreign invasion by the natural barriers of desert and sea. The idea that foreigners could not only invade Egypt but actually rule it was almost incomprehensible to the Egyptian worldview. The Hyksos established their capital at Avaris in the eastern delta, a city that became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan in the ancient world. Archaeological excavations at Tel el-Daba, the site of ancient Avaris, have revealed a city with distinctly non-Egyptian characteristics: Asiatic-style houses, foreign pottery, and evidence of horse burials, a practice completely alien to Egyptian tradition. Yet the Hyksos were not simply foreign conquerors imposing their will on a subjugated population. They were remarkably adaptive rulers who understood that they needed to accommodate Egyptian traditions and beliefs if they wanted to maintain control. Many Hyksos rulers adopted Egyptian royal titles, built temples to Egyptian gods, and employed Egyptian scribes and administrators. The most famous of the Hyksos rulers was Kion, whose name appears on monuments as far away as Crete and Mesopotamia, suggesting that the Hyksos maintained extensive trade networks throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Another notable ruler was Apophis, who engaged in diplomatic correspondence with the king of Kush in Nubia, attempting to create an alliance that would squeeze the remaining Egyptian rulers in the south. But while the Hyksos controlled the north, Egyptian pharaohs continued to rule in the south from their capital at Thebes. These Theban rulers, who formed the 17th dynasty, were initially content to pay tribute to the Hyksos and maintain their independence in Upper Egypt. However, as time passed, they began to chafe under foreign domination and dream of reuniting Egypt under native rule. The tension between the Hyksos and the Theban pharaohs is illustrated in a famous literary text known as the Quarrel of Apophis and Seqenenre. According to this story, the Hyksos king Apophis sent a message to the Theban pharaoh Seqenenre, complaining that the noise of hippopotamuses in Thebes was keeping him awake at night. Despite the fact that Avaris was hundreds of miles away from Thebes, this was clearly a pretext for conflict, an insult designed to provoke the Theban ruler into rebellion. Whether this particular story is historical or not, we know that Seqenenre did indeed go to war against the Hyksos. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, shows evidence of severe head wounds that were probably inflicted by Hyksos weapons. He appears to have died in battle, but his sacrifice was not in vain. It began the war of liberation that would eventually drive the Hyksos from Egypt. The war was continued by Seqenenre's son, Kamose, who launched a series of campaigns against Hyksos positions in Middle Egypt. Kamose's war bulletins, carved on stelae at Karnak, provide vivid accounts of these battles. I sailed north because I was strong, to attack the Asiatics through the might of Amun, the just of counsels. My valiant army was in front of me like a breath of fire. But it was Kamose's brother, Ahmose, who would complete the liberation of Egypt. Ahmose, who founded the 18th dynasty and is considered the first pharaoh of the New Kingdom, spent the early years of his reign systematically reducing Hyksos strongholds throughout the delta. The final siege of Avaris was a lengthy affair, but when the city finally fell around 1,550 years before the Common Era, Hyksos rule in Egypt came to an end. The expulsion of the Hyksos was more than just a military victory. It was a cultural and psychological triumph that would reshape Egyptian civilization for centuries to come. The Egyptians had learned that their land was not invulnerable, that foreign invasion was possible, and that they needed to be prepared to defend themselves against external threats. This new awareness led to fundamental changes in Egyptian military organization and strategy. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom would create the first professional army in Egyptian history, equipped with the same advanced weapons that had given the Hyksos their initial advantage. They would also adopt an aggressive foreign policy, conquering territories in Nubia and the Levant to create buffer zones that would protect Egypt from future invasions. But the Hyksos period also had positive effects on Egyptian civilization. The foreign rulers had brought new technologies, new ideas, and new cultural influences that enriched Egyptian society. The horse and chariot, introduced by the Hyksos, would become symbols of pharaonic power. New musical instruments, artistic techniques, and literary forms all entered Egyptian culture during this period. Perhaps most importantly, the Hyksos period forced the Egyptians to become more cosmopolitan and outward-looking. The isolation that had characterized earlier periods of Egyptian history was no longer possible in a world where foreign peoples could migrate across vast distances and establish kingdoms far from their homelands. The Egyptians would need to engage with the wider world if they wanted to maintain their independence and prosperity. The Second Intermediate Period also saw important developments in Egyptian religion. The god Amun, who had been a relatively minor Theban deity during the Middle Kingdom, rose to prominence during the struggle against the Hyksos. The Theban pharaohs credited Amun with their victories, and when they reunited Egypt, they made him the supreme god of the Egyptian pantheon. Amun would eventually be merged with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The period also witnessed the continued democratization of Egyptian religion. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, became widely available during this period. Unlike the earlier pyramid texts and coffin texts, which had been restricted to royalty and nobility, The Book of the Dead could be purchased by anyone who could afford it, further expanding access to the magical knowledge needed for eternal life. The art and literature of the Second Intermediate Period reflect the trauma and uncertainty of foreign rule. Texts from this period often express nostalgia for the glorious past and hope for future restoration. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, which may date from this period, describes a world turned upside down where the land turns around as does a potter's wheel, and servants have become masters. Yet even in the darkest moments of foreign domination, Egyptian culture proved remarkably resilient. The hieroglyphic script continued to be used, Egyptian religious practices were maintained, and the fundamental structures of Egyptian society remained intact. The Hyksos may have ruled Egypt, but they had not destroyed it. When Ahmose finally expelled the last of the Hyksos rulers and reunited Egypt under native rule, he was not just restoring the old order, he was creating something new. The new kingdom that emerged from the ashes of the Second Intermediate Period would be more militaristic, more cosmopolitan, and more powerful than any previous Egyptian dynasty. The pharaohs of the new kingdom would learn from both the successes and failures of their predecessors. They would combine the administrative sophistication of the Middle Kingdom with the monumental ambitions of the Old Kingdom while adding new elements borrowed from their foreign enemies. They would create an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, making Egypt the dominant power in the ancient world for over 4 centuries. But they would never forget the lessons of the Hyksos period. The knowledge that Egypt was vulnerable to foreign invasion would drive them to constant vigilance and aggressive expansion. The memory of foreign rule would make them suspicious of outsiders and determined to maintain Egyptian cultural purity. The trauma of the Second Intermediate Period would shape Egyptian foreign policy for the rest of the Pharaonic period. As Ahmose placed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt upon his head, he was not just becoming pharaoh, he was becoming the founder of a new kind of Egyptian kingship. The pharaohs of the new kingdom would be warrior kings, conquerors, and empire builders who would make Egypt the greatest power in the ancient world. The age of isolation was over. The age of empire was about to begin. The expulsion of the Hyksos by Ahmose around 1,550 years before the Common Era marked the beginning of the most glorious period in Egyptian history. The New Kingdom, lasting from approximately 1,550 to 1,070 years before the Common Era, was Egypt's imperial age, a time when pharaohs commanded armies that marched from Nubia to the Euphrates, when Egyptian gold flowed through international trade networks, and when the names of Egyptian kings were known and feared from Anatolia to the heart of Africa. This was the Egypt of Tutankhamun's golden treasures, of Ramses the Great's colossal monuments, of Hatshepsut's magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari. It was an age when Egypt didn't just survive in a dangerous world. It dominated that world, imposing its will on enemies and allies alike through a combination of military might, diplomatic skill, and sheer cultural prestige. The transformation began with Ahmose himself, who understood that expelling the Hyksos was only the first step in securing Egypt's future. The pharaohs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms had been content to rule within Egypt's traditional borders, relying on natural barriers to protect them from foreign threats. But the Hyksos invasion had shattered that illusion of security. If Egypt wanted to remain independent, it would need to control the territories from which future invasions might come. Ahmose began this process by pursuing the fleeing Hyksos into Palestine, besieging their strongholds and ensuring that they could never again threaten Egypt. But his successors would go much further, creating an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. The architect of this empire was Thutmose III, who ruled from 1,479 to 1,425 years before the Common Era. Known to later generations as Egypt's Napoleon, Thutmose III conducted 17 military campaigns during his 54-year reign, personally leading his armies into battle and winning victories that made Egypt the dominant power in the ancient Near East. Thutmose III's most famous victory came at the Battle of Megiddo in 1,457 years before the Common Era, where he defeated a coalition of Canaanite princes who had rebelled against Egyptian rule. The pharaoh's account of the battle, carved on the walls of the Karnak temple, reads like an ancient military manual. His Majesty proceeded northward, his infantry and his chariotry with him. The good way of going which leads to Aruna was taken. His Majesty came forth at the head of his army himself, showing the way by his footsteps. The victory at Megiddo opened the way for Egyptian expansion into Syria and Palestine. Thutmose III captured over 300 cities during his campaigns, bringing vast wealth back to Egypt in the form of tribute, slaves, and exotic goods. The walls of Karnak Temple are covered with lists of the tribute he received: gold from Nubia, silver from Anatolia, cedar wood from Lebanon, horses from Mitanni, and exotic animals from the far reaches of Africa and Asia. But the New Kingdom pharaohs were not just conquerors. They were also skilled diplomats who understood that military force alone could not maintain an empire. They developed a sophisticated system of international relations based on treaties, marriages, and the exchange of gifts and ambassadors. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, provide a fascinating glimpse into this ancient world of international politics. These letters reveal a complex web of relationships between the great powers of the ancient Near East. The pharaoh corresponded with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites as equals, addressing them as brother and negotiating marriages between their children. Lesser rulers in Palestine and Syria wrote to the pharaoh as vassals, reporting on local conditions and requesting military support against their enemies. The wealth that flowed into Egypt from its empire was staggering. Gold from the Nubian mines, tribute from conquered territories, and profits from international trade made the New Kingdom pharaohs the richest rulers in the ancient world. This wealth was used to fund massive building projects that transformed the Egyptian landscape and created some of the most magnificent monuments in human history. The temple complex at Karnak, dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, became the largest religious building in the ancient world. Generation after generation of pharaohs added to the complex, creating a vast maze of temples, chapels, obelisks, and courtyards that covered over 200 acres. The Great Hypostyle Hall, built by Seti I and Ramses II, contains 134 massive columns, some over 60 feet tall, arranged in 16 rows that create a forest of stone. But perhaps the most impressive monument of the New Kingdom was Abu Simbel, the twin temples carved into the cliffs of southern Nubia by Ramses II. The larger temple features 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh, each over 60 feet tall, seated eternally on their thrones and gazing out over the Nile. The smaller temple was dedicated to Ramses' beloved wife, Nefertari, and the goddess Hathor. These monuments were not just expressions of royal ego. They were carefully calculated political statements designed to impress both Egyptian subjects and foreign visitors with the power and wealth of the pharaoh. The message was clear. Egypt was the greatest civilization in the world, and its pharaoh was the most powerful ruler on earth. The New Kingdom also saw remarkable developments in Egyptian art, literature, and culture. The rigid, formal style of earlier periods gave way to more naturalistic and expressive works. Artists began to experiment with new techniques, creating paintings and sculptures that captured movement, emotion, and individual personality in ways that had never been attempted before. The tomb paintings of the New Kingdom are particularly remarkable for their vivid depictions of daily life. The tomb of Nebamun, a scribe and grain accountant, contains scenes of hunting in the marshes, banqueting with family and friends, and overseeing agricultural work that provide an intimate glimpse into the lives of Egypt's middle class. These paintings reveal a society that had achieved remarkable prosperity and sophistication, where even minor officials could afford elaborate tomb decorations. The literature of the New Kingdom reflects the cosmopolitan outlook of an imperial age. Egyptian scribes translated foreign texts, adapted foreign stories, and incorporated foreign words into their vocabulary. The Tale of the Two Brothers shows clear influence from Mesopotamian literature, while the Report of Wenamun describes the adventures of an Egyptian official traveling through the Levant in search of cedar wood for the god Amun's sacred boat. But the New Kingdom was also marked by religious upheaval that would shake Egyptian civilization to its foundations. Around 1,350 years before the Common Era, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV launched a religious revolution that attempted to replace Egypt's traditional polytheistic religion with the worship of a single god, the Aten. Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and moved his capital from Thebes to a new city called Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. He closed the temples of the traditional gods, disbanded their priesthoods, and declared that the Aten was the only true god. This was not just a religious reform. It was a complete transformation of Egyptian culture and society. The art of the Amarna period reflects this revolutionary spirit. The rigid, idealized style of traditional Egyptian art was replaced by a more naturalistic approach that showed the royal family in intimate domestic scenes. Akhenaten was depicted with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and a protruding belly, features that would have been unthinkable in traditional royal art. His wife, Nefertiti, was shown as his equal partner, sometimes even wearing the pharaoh's crown. But Akhenaten's revolution was too radical for Egyptian society to accept. The traditional priesthoods, the military, and the common people all opposed the new religion. When Akhenaten died around 1,336 years before the Common Era, his successors quickly abandoned his reforms. His capital was abandoned, his monuments were destroyed, and his name was erased from official records. The restoration of traditional religion was completed by the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, whose tomb, discovered intact by Howard Carter in 1922, has provided us with the most complete picture of New Kingdom royal burial practices. The tomb contained over 5,000 objects, including the famous golden death mask that has become one of the most recognizable artifacts from ancient Egypt. But Tutankhamun's reign was brief, and real power was restored by the military commander Horemheb, who founded the 19th dynasty and began the process of rebuilding Egypt's empire. His successors, Seti I and Ramses II, would restore Egypt to its former glory and create some of the most magnificent monuments in Egyptian history. Ramses II, who ruled for 66 years from 1,279 to 1,213 years before the Common Era, was perhaps the greatest of all the New Kingdom pharaohs. He conducted numerous military campaigns, built more monuments than any other pharaoh, and fathered over 100 children. His reign marked the high point of Egyptian power and prosperity. But even Ramses the Great could not prevent the gradual decline that would eventually end the New Kingdom. Egypt faced increasing pressure from new enemies: the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who attacked the eastern Mediterranean around 1,200 years before the Common Era; the Libyans, who pressed against Egypt's western borders; and the Nubians, who gradually asserted their independence in the south. The cost of maintaining the empire became increasingly burdensome. The wealth that had once flowed into Egypt from conquered territories began to dry up as local rulers asserted their independence. The priesthood of Amun-Ra accumulated so much wealth and power that they began to challenge the authority of the pharaoh himself. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1,070 years before the Common Era, the New Kingdom was in terminal decline. The last great pharaoh, Ramses V, ruled over a divided country where the high priest of Amun controlled the south, while the pharaoh's authority was limited to the north. The age of empire was coming to an end, but the legacy of the New Kingdom would endure long after its political power had faded. The monuments built during this period, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the great temples of Abu Simbel, would inspire awe and wonder for millennia to come. The artistic and literary achievements of the period would influence Egyptian culture for the rest of the pharaonic period. Most importantly, the New Kingdom had established Egypt's reputation as one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. The pharaohs of this period had shown that Egypt could not only survive in a dangerous world, but could dominate it, imposing its will on enemies and allies alike through a combination of military might, diplomatic skill, and cultural prestige. The imperial age was ending, but the memory of Egypt's greatness would live on, inspiring future generations to dream of restoring their country to its former glory. The New Kingdom had shown what Egypt was capable of achieving when it combined traditional wisdom with imperial ambition, divine authority with military power, and cultural confidence with cosmopolitan outlook. As the sun set on the new kingdom, it left behind a legacy that would define Egyptian civilization for the rest of its long history. Egypt might never again achieve the same level of power and prosperity, but it would never forget the lessons of its imperial age, lessons about the importance of military strength, diplomatic skill, and cultural confidence in a dangerous and competitive world. The collapse of the New Kingdom around 1,070 years before the Common Era marked the beginning of another period of political fragmentation and foreign domination that historians call the Third Intermediate Period. Lasting from approximately 1,070 to 664 years before the Common Era, this was a time when Egypt's unity shattered once again, when foreign dynasties ruled from the north while native pharaohs clung to power in the south, and when the very survival of Egyptian civilization seemed to hang in the balance. The seeds of this collapse had been planted during the final years of the New Kingdom. The cost of maintaining Egypt's empire had become increasingly burdensome, draining the royal treasury and exhausting the country's resources. The priesthood of Amun-Ra had accumulated so much wealth and power that they had become virtually independent rulers in their own right. Foreign invasions by the Sea Peoples and Libyan tribes had weakened Egypt's military and damaged its prestige. When Ramses V, the last pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, died around 1,070 years before the Common Era, Egypt was already effectively divided. In the north, a new dynasty of pharaohs ruled from Tanis, a city in the Nile Delta that had been built largely from stones taken from the abandoned Ramesside capital of Pi-Ramesses. In the south, the high priests of Amun controlled Thebes and Upper Egypt, ruling as virtual pharaohs while maintaining the fiction that they served the northern kings. This division was formalized during the 21st dynasty, when the pharaohs in Tanis and the priest-kings in Thebes established a complex system of shared rule. The northern pharaohs controlled Lower Egypt and maintained diplomatic relations with foreign powers, while the southern priest-kings controlled Upper Egypt and the wealth of the Nubian gold mines. Marriages between the two royal families helped maintain this delicate balance, but it was clear that Egypt was no longer the unified, powerful kingdom it had been during the New Kingdom. The weakness of the divided kingdom soon attracted the attention of foreign invaders. Around 945 years before the Common Era, a Libyan chieftain named Shoshenq seized control of the northern kingdom and founded the 22nd dynasty. The Libyans had been settling in the Nile Delta for generations, serving as mercenaries in the Egyptian army and gradually assimilating into Egyptian society. But Shoshenq's coup marked the first time since the Hyksos that foreigners had ruled Egypt as pharaohs. Shoshenq I, known in the Bible as Shishak, attempted to restore Egypt's former glory through military conquest. He launched a successful campaign into Palestine around 925 years before the Common Era, sacking Jerusalem and carrying off the treasures of Solomon's temple. This victory, recorded both in Egyptian inscriptions and in the biblical account, briefly restored Egypt's prestige in the ancient Near East. But Shoshenq's successors were unable to maintain this momentum. The Libyan dynasties gradually lost control over Upper Egypt, where local rulers asserted their independence and established their own kingdoms. By the 8th century before the Common Era, Egypt was divided among dozens of competing dynasties, each controlling a small territory and claiming the title of pharaoh. This political fragmentation was accompanied by economic decline and cultural stagnation. The great building projects that had characterized earlier periods came to an end as resources were diverted to constant warfare between rival dynasties. Trade networks collapsed as foreign merchants lost confidence in Egypt's stability. The irrigation systems that had sustained Egyptian agriculture for millennia fell into disrepair as local rulers focused on short-term military goals rather than long-term economic development. The art and literature of the Third Intermediate Period reflect this decline. The grand, confident style of the New Kingdom gave way to smaller, more modest works that often copied earlier models rather than creating new forms. The quality of craftsmanship declined as skilled artisans fled the chaos or were unable to find wealthy patrons. Even the hieroglyphic script began to deteriorate as scribal schools closed and literacy rates declined. Yet even in this dark period, Egyptian civilization showed remarkable resilience. The fundamental structures of Egyptian society, the administrative system, the religious hierarchy, the cultural traditions, survived the political chaos. Local rulers continued to build temples, commission statues, and patronize artists, even if on a smaller scale than their predecessors. The Egyptian language continued to evolve, and new literary works were created that reflected the concerns and anxieties of the age. One of the most remarkable developments of the Third Intermediate Period was the rise of Nubian power in the south. The kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata near the Fourth Cataract of the Nile, had been an Egyptian colony during the New Kingdom. But as Egyptian power declined, the Nubians gradually asserted their independence and began to develop their own distinctive culture that combined Egyptian and African elements. The Nubian kings, who called themselves pharaohs and adopted Egyptian royal titles, saw themselves as the true heirs of ancient Egyptian civilization. They were deeply religious, devoted to the god Amun-Ra, and committed to restoring the traditional values that they believed had made Egypt great. When they looked north at the divided, chaotic kingdom that Egypt had become, they saw an opportunity to fulfill their destiny as the rightful rulers of the Nile Valley. Around 750 years before the Common Era, the Nubian king Piye launched a campaign to conquer Egypt and restore its ancient glory. His victory stela, discovered at Gabel Barkal in Sudan, provides a detailed account of his conquest. His Majesty proceeded northward to overthrow wrongdoing throughout this land, to cause the two lands to live in peace. Piye's conquest was remarkably successful. One by one, the petty kingdoms of Egypt submitted to his authority. The Libyan dynasties in the north were defeated or co-opted. The priest kings of Thebes welcomed him as a liberator who would restore the proper worship of Amun-Ra. By 728 years before the Common Era, Piye controlled all of Egypt from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean Sea. The Nubian conquest marked the beginning of the 25th dynasty, also known as the Kushite dynasty. For nearly a century, Egypt was ruled by black African pharaohs who saw themselves as the restorers of ancient Egyptian civilization. These Nubian pharaohs were more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves. They revived Old Kingdom artistic styles, restored ancient temples, and promoted traditional religious practices that had been neglected during the chaotic years of the Third Intermediate Period. The most famous of the Nubian pharaohs was Taharqa, who ruled from 690 to 664 years before the Common Era. Taharqa was a great builder who constructed temples throughout Egypt and Nubia, including additions to the temple complex at Karnak that rivaled the work of the New Kingdom pharaohs. He also attempted to restore Egypt's international prestige by intervening in the politics of the Levant, supporting local rulers against the growing power of Assyria. But Taharqa's ambitions brought him into conflict with the most powerful empire of the age. The Assyrians, who had conquered most of the ancient Near East, saw Egyptian interference in their sphere of influence as an intolerable threat. In 671 years before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon launched a massive invasion of Egypt, defeating Taharqa's armies and occupying Memphis. The Assyrian conquest of Egypt was a traumatic event that shattered the confidence of a civilization that had considered itself invulnerable for over 2 millennia. The Assyrians were ruthless conquerors who showed little respect for Egyptian traditions or religious beliefs. They looted temples, destroyed monuments, and deported thousands of Egyptians to other parts of their empire. Taharqa managed to regain control of southern Egypt and launched several attempts to reconquer the north, but the Assyrians proved too powerful. His successor, Tanutamani, made one final effort to drive out the invaders in 663 years before the Common Era, but was decisively defeated. The Nubian pharaohs were forced to retreat to their homeland in Sudan, where they continued to rule an independent kingdom for another 1,000 years. With the Nubians gone, the Assyrians faced the problem of governing Egypt, a task that proved beyond their capabilities. The country was too large, too distant from the Assyrian heartland, and too culturally distinct to be effectively administered as a province. Instead, the Assyrians chose to rule through local vassals, Egyptian nobles who were willing to collaborate with the foreign occupiers in exchange for limited autonomy. The most successful of these collaborators was Psamtik I, a prince from the city of Sais in the western delta. Psamtik had initially served as an Assyrian vassal, but as Assyrian power began to decline in the mid-7th century before the Common Era, he gradually asserted his independence. Using a combination of diplomacy, military force, and Greek mercenaries, Psamtik managed to unite Egypt under his rule and found the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate dynasty. The Sate pharaohs, ruling from 664 to 525 years before the Common Era, presided over a remarkable renaissance in Egyptian civilization. They consciously modeled themselves on the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, reviving ancient artistic styles, religious practices, and administrative systems. This Sate Renaissance was not mere nostalgia. It was a deliberate attempt to reconnect with Egypt's glorious past and restore the country's confidence in itself. Psamtik and his successors were skilled rulers who understood that Egypt's survival depended on adapting to the realities of a changing world. They welcomed foreign merchants and mercenaries, established trading posts throughout the Mediterranean, and developed Egypt's first true navy. They also promoted the worship of sacred animals, particularly the Apis bull at Memphis and the sacred cats at Bubastis, as a way of emphasizing Egypt's unique cultural identity. The Site period saw remarkable achievements in art and architecture. The tomb of Mentuhotep at Thebes, with its elaborate decorations and innovative architectural features, rivals the great tombs of the New Kingdom. The bronze sculptures of the period, particularly the sacred animal figures, represent some of the finest metalwork ever produced in Egypt. The Site pharaohs also undertook major restoration projects, repairing monuments that had been damaged during the chaotic years of the Third Intermediate Period. But perhaps the most significant achievement of the Sate dynasty was the creation of a new sense of Egyptian identity that could survive foreign conquest and cultural change. The Sate pharaohs understood that Egypt's strength lay not just in its military power or economic wealth, but in its cultural traditions and religious beliefs. By reviving and promoting these traditions, they created a form of Egyptian nationalism that would endure long after their dynasty had fallen. The Sate Renaissance came to an abrupt end in 525 years before the Common Era, when the Persian king Cambyses conquered Egypt and incorporated it into the Persian Empire. The conquest was swift and decisive. The last Site pharaoh, Psamtik III, was defeated at the Battle of Pelusium and taken prisoner to Persia, where he was eventually executed. The Persian conquest marked the end of the Third Intermediate Period and the beginning of the late period of Egyptian history. For the next 2 centuries, Egypt would be ruled by foreign empires, first the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. The age of independent Egyptian pharaohs was effectively over, though there would be brief periods of native rule during the 4th century before the Common Era. As we look back on the Third Intermediate Period, we see a civilization that was tested to its very limits, but ultimately survived. The political fragmentation, foreign invasions, and cultural decline of this period might have destroyed a less resilient society. But Egypt's fundamental institutions, its administrative system, its religious hierarchy, its cultural traditions, proved strong enough to survive even the most severe challenges. The Third Intermediate Period also demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Egyptian civilization. The Nubian pharaohs showed that Egyptian culture could be adopted and adapted by foreign rulers who genuinely respected its traditions. The Site pharaohs proved that Egypt could learn from its past while adapting to present realities. Even under foreign rule, Egyptian scribes, priests, and artisans continued to preserve and transmit the cultural heritage that had been accumulating for over 2 millennia. Most importantly, the Third Intermediate Period established patterns that would characterize the rest of Egyptian history. The tension between native traditions and foreign influences, the importance of cultural identity in maintaining social cohesion, the role of religion in preserving continuity during times of political change, all of these themes would continue to shape Egyptian civilization until the end of the Pharaonic period. The Third Intermediate Period was ending, but its lessons would endure. Egypt had learned that political independence was not guaranteed, that foreign rule was not necessarily permanent, and that cultural identity could survive even the most severe challenges. These lessons would serve the Egyptians well in the centuries to come, as they faced new conquerors, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate the enduring power of their ancient civilization. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 years before the Common Era marked the beginning of the Late Period, the final chapter in the long story of pharaonic Egypt. From 525 years before the Common Era until the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 years before the Common Era, Egypt would be ruled primarily by foreign powers, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, who would transform the ancient kingdom into a province of vast multinational empires. Yet this period of foreign domination was not simply a story of decline and decay. The late period witnessed remarkable cultural achievements, religious innovations, and artistic revivals that demonstrated the enduring vitality of Egyptian civilization. Even under foreign rule, Egypt remained Egypt, a land apart, a civilization that could absorb foreign influences while maintaining its essential character. The Persian conquest was led by Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, who had already conquered most of the ancient Near East. The Persians were experienced empire builders who understood that successful rule required accommodation with local traditions and beliefs. Unlike the Assyrians, who had ruled through terror and destruction, the Persians generally respected the customs of their subject peoples and allowed them considerable autonomy in religious and cultural matters. Cambyses himself was crowned as pharaoh according to traditional Egyptian rituals, and he made offerings to Egyptian gods in their temples. However, later Egyptian sources, particularly the writings of the priest Manetho, portrayed Cambyses as a mad tyrant who killed the sacred Apis bull and committed other sacrilegious acts. These accounts were probably propaganda designed to legitimize later rebellions against Persian rule, but they reflect the deep resentment that many Egyptians felt toward their foreign rulers. The Persian period, known as the 27th dynasty, lasted from 525 to 404 years before the Common Era. During this time, Egypt was governed by Persian satraps, provincial governors, who answered to the great king in Persepolis. The Persians maintained the traditional administrative structure of Egypt, using Egyptian officials and scribes to collect taxes and maintain order. One of the most remarkable Persian rulers of Egypt was Darius I, who ruled from 522 to 486 years before the Common Era. Darius was a great builder and administrator who undertook major construction projects throughout his empire. In Egypt, he completed a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, a project that had been begun by the site Pharaoh Necho II. This canal, a predecessor to the modern Suez Canal, facilitated trade between Egypt and the Persian Gulf and demonstrated the Persians' commitment to developing Egypt's economy. Darius also commissioned the construction of a magnificent temple to Amun at the Karga Oasis in the western desert. This temple, built in traditional Egyptian style but funded by Persian resources, symbolized the complex relationship between the foreign rulers and their Egyptian subjects. The Persians needed Egyptian cooperation to govern effectively, while the Egyptians needed Persian resources to maintain their religious and cultural institutions. Despite these accommodations, Persian rule was never fully accepted by the Egyptian people. The memory of independence remained strong, and several major rebellions erupted during the Persian period. The most serious of these occurred in 460 years before the Common Era, when a Libyan prince named Inaros led a revolt that temporarily drove the Persians from most of Egypt. The rebellion was eventually crushed with the help of Athenian naval forces, but it demonstrated that Egyptian resistance to foreign rule remained strong. The Persian period came to an end in 404 years before the Common Era, when Amyrtaeus, a prince from the delta city of Sais, successfully rebelled against Persian rule and established the 28th dynasty. This marked the beginning of the last period of independent Egyptian rule, lasting from 404 to 343 years before the Common Era. The pharaohs of the 29th and 30th dynasties, ruling from Mendes and Sebennytos respectively, attempted to restore Egypt's former glory through military conquest and monumental building projects. Nectanebo Orpharon and Nectanebo II, the last great native pharaohs, built extensively throughout Egypt, adding to temples at Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, and Dendera. Their reliefs and inscriptions consciously imitated the style of the New Kingdom, reflecting their desire to connect their reigns with Egypt's imperial past. These last native pharaohs also attempted to restore Egypt's international prestige by intervening in the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. They supported Greek city-states in their wars against Persia, provided refuge for Persian rebels, and even attempted to reconquer Palestine and Syria. However, these ambitious foreign policies ultimately proved counterproductive, as they provoked the Persians to launch a new invasion of Egypt. In 343 years before the Common Era, the Persian king Artaxerxes III conquered Egypt and established the 31st dynasty, the second period of Persian rule. This second Persian occupation was harsher than the first, as the Persians were determined to prevent further rebellions. Temples were looted, Egyptian nobles were deported, and the country was heavily taxed to fund Persian military campaigns elsewhere. The second Persian period was brief, lasting only until 332 years before the Common Era, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt as part of his campaign against the Persian Empire. Alexander's conquest was welcomed by many Egyptians, who saw the young Macedonian king as a liberator from Persian oppression. Alexander was careful to respect Egyptian religious traditions, making offerings to the gods and consulting the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, where he was reportedly hailed as the son of the god. Alexander's most lasting contribution to Egypt was the foundation of Alexandria, the great port city that would become the intellectual and commercial capital of the Hellenistic world. Located on the Mediterranean coast at the western edge of the Nile Delta, Alexandria was designed to be a bridge between Egypt and the Greek world, a cosmopolitan city where Egyptian, Greek, and other cultures could meet and interact. When Alexander died in 323 years before the Common Era, his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greeks who maintained their Hellenic identity while adopting the traditional role of Egyptian pharaohs. The Ptolemaic period, lasting from 305 to 30 years before the Common Era, was one of the most culturally rich and complex periods in Egyptian history. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, which became the largest city in the Mediterranean world and a center of learning that attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from across the known world. The famous Library of Alexandria, founded by Ptolemy I and expanded by his successors, was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. It contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls covering every field of human learning: literature, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and geography. The scholars who worked at the library made groundbreaking discoveries that advanced human knowledge in countless ways. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Euclid developed the principles of geometry that are still taught today. Archimedes made fundamental discoveries in mathematics and physics. Hipparchus created the first accurate star catalog and discovered the precession of the equinoxes. The medical school of Alexandria advanced the understanding of human anatomy and surgical techniques. But the Ptolemaic period was not just about Greek learning. It was also a time of remarkable synthesis between Egyptian and Greek cultures. The Ptolemies adopted Egyptian royal titles and religious practices, building temples to Egyptian gods and participating in traditional festivals. They also promoted the worship of Serapis, a new god who combined aspects of the Egyptian Osiris with the Greek Zeus, creating a deity that could appeal to both Egyptian and Greek subjects. The art of the Ptolemaic period reflects this cultural synthesis. Egyptian temples built during this time, such as those at Edfu, Dendera, and Philae, follow traditional Egyptian architectural principles but incorporate Greek decorative elements. The famous Rosetta Stone, created during the reign of Ptolemy I, contains the same text in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic script, and Greek, symbolizing the multilingual, multicultural nature of Ptolemaic Egypt. The most famous of the Ptolemaic rulers was Cleopatra VII, who ruled from 69 to 30 years before the Common Era. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, and she actively promoted Egyptian culture and religion. She saw herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, and used this religious identity to legitimize her rule and rally Egyptian support against Roman interference. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not just romantic liaisons but political alliances designed to preserve Egyptian independence in the face of growing Roman power. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on finding powerful Roman protectors who could shield the kingdom from conquest by other Roman generals. But Cleopatra's strategy ultimately failed. After the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 years before the Common Era, Egypt was conquered by Octavian, later Augustus, and incorporated into the Roman Empire. Cleopatra's suicide in 30 years before the Common Era marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the end of Pharaonic Egypt. The Roman conquest of Egypt was different from previous foreign conquests. The Romans did not adopt Egyptian royal titles or participate in Egyptian religious ceremonies. Instead, they treated Egypt as a personal possession of the Roman emperor, a source of grain and wealth that was too important to be entrusted to the Roman Senate or provincial governors. Under Roman rule, Egypt became the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world, exporting millions of tons of grain annually to feed the population of Rome and other Roman cities. The Romans also exploited Egypt's other resources: gold from Nubian mines, papyrus from delta marshes, and luxury goods from Red Sea trade routes. Yet even under Roman rule, Egyptian culture continued to flourish in many ways. The Romans, like the Persians and Greeks before them, found it necessary to accommodate Egyptian religious traditions and cultural practices. Roman emperors were depicted on temple walls in traditional pharaonic regalia, making offerings to Egyptian gods according to ancient rituals. The great temples of Dendera, Edfu, and Philae continued to function as centers of Egyptian religion and learning. The Roman period also witnessed the rise of Christianity in Egypt, which would fundamentally transform Egyptian culture and society. According to tradition, Christianity was brought to Egypt by the Apostle Mark around 60 years of the Common Era. The new religion found fertile ground among Egypt's diverse population, particularly in Alexandria, where Greek philosophical traditions had prepared the intellectual groundwork for monotheistic beliefs. Egyptian Christianity, known as Coptic Christianity, developed its own distinctive characteristics that reflected the country's ancient religious traditions. The Coptic Church emphasized the divine nature of Christ, drawing on Egyptian concepts of divine kingship and the god Pharaoh. Coptic monasticism, which began in the Egyptian desert with figures like Saint Anthony and Saint Pachomius, would profoundly influence Christian practice throughout the world. The Coptic language, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language written in a modified Greek alphabet, became the liturgical language of Egyptian Christianity. Coptic literature flourished during the Roman and Byzantine periods, producing works of theology, hagiography, and biblical translation that preserved many aspects of ancient Egyptian thought and culture. The Roman period also saw the final flowering of traditional Egyptian religion. The Temple of Isis at Philae, built during the Ptolemaic period and expanded under Roman rule, became the last major center of ancient Egyptian worship. Pilgrims traveled from across the Roman Empire to visit this sacred island, where the goddess Isis was believed to have reassembled the body of her murdered husband Osiris. The priests of Philae maintained the ancient traditions with remarkable fidelity, continuing to write in hieroglyphs long after the script had been abandoned elsewhere in Egypt. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae in 394 years of the Common Era, marking the end of a writing system that had been in continuous use for over 3,000 years. But the ancient religion was gradually giving way to Christianity. In 313 years of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity throughout the empire, and by the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of Rome. The old temples were closed, their priesthoods disbanded, and their sacred rituals forbidden. The transition from paganism to Christianity was not always peaceful. In 391 years of the Common Era, a Christian mob destroyed the Great Serapeum of Alexandria, one of the most magnificent temples in the ancient world. The famous Library of Alexandria, already in decline, was finally abandoned as Christian authorities showed little interest in preserving pagan learning. Yet the Christianization of Egypt also preserved many aspects of ancient Egyptian culture in new forms. Christian churches were often built on the sites of ancient temples, using stones from the older structures. Christian art incorporated traditional Egyptian symbols and motifs, giving them new Christian meanings. The Ankh, the ancient Egyptian symbol of life, became a Christian cross. The image of Isis nursing the infant Horus influenced Christian depictions of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. The Byzantine period, lasting from 330 years to 641 years of the Common Era, saw Egypt become increasingly isolated from the broader currents of Mediterranean civilization. The Coptic Church developed its own theological traditions that often conflicted with the official doctrines of Constantinople. The Coptic language gradually replaced Greek as the language of daily life, creating a more distinctly Egyptian Christian culture. This isolation made Egypt vulnerable to new conquerors. In 641 years of the Common Era, Arab armies led by Amr ibn al-As conquered Egypt and incorporated it into the rapidly expanding Islamic Empire. The Arab conquest marked the end of the ancient world in Egypt and the beginning of a new chapter in the country's long history. The Islamic conquest was relatively peaceful, as many Egyptians welcomed the Arabs as liberators from Byzantine oppression. The Arabs allowed Christians and Jews to practice their religions freely in exchange for paying a special tax, and they adopted many aspects of Egyptian administrative and agricultural practices. Yet the Arab conquest also marked the final end of Pharaonic Egypt. The ancient temples were abandoned or converted into churches and mosques. The hieroglyphic script was forgotten, and knowledge of ancient Egyptian history and culture was lost. The Nile still flowed from south to north, the sun still rose over the eastern desert, but the civilization that had flourished along the river for over 3,000 years had finally come to an end. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through ancient Egyptian history, it's worth reflecting on what made this civilization so remarkable and enduring. For over 3 millennia, from the unification under Narmer around 3,100 years before the Common Era to the death of Cleopatra, in 30 years before the Common Era, Egypt maintained a distinctive cultural identity that survived conquest, foreign rule, religious upheaval, and social transformation. The secret of Egypt's longevity lay not in its military power or economic wealth, though both were important at various times, but in its cultural resilience. The Egyptians developed a worldview that was both flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and stable enough to maintain continuity across centuries of change. They created institutions, the pharaonic monarchy, the priestly hierarchy, the scribal schools, that could survive political upheaval and foreign conquest. Most importantly, the Egyptians created a sense of identity that was rooted in their unique relationship with the Nile River and the land it nourished. Whether they were ruled by native pharaohs or foreign kings, whether they worshipped traditional gods or adopted new religions, the Egyptians remained fundamentally Egyptian. They were the people of the Nile, the children of the Black Land, the heirs of a civilization that had achieved greatness when the world was young. The monuments they built, the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, still stand today as testaments to their achievements. The art they created, the literature they wrote, the scientific discoveries they made, all continue to inspire and inform us, thousands of years after their creators have returned to dust. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient Egypt is the example it provides of human potential. The Egyptians showed that it was possible to create a civilization that was both materially prosperous and spiritually rich, both politically stable and culturally dynamic, both rooted in tradition and open to innovation. They demonstrated that human beings could work together to achieve greatness, that they could create beauty that would outlast empires, and that they could develop wisdom that would guide future generations. The pharaohs are gone. Their palaces are ruins. Their empire has crumbled into dust. But the spirit of ancient Egypt lives on. In the monuments that still inspire wonder, in the stories that still captivate our imagination, and in the eternal human aspiration to build something greater than ourselves, something that will endure long after we are gone. The Nile still flows from south to north, carrying the gift of life through the desert as it has for millions of years. The sun still rises over the eastern cliffs and sets behind the western mountains, marking the passage of days and seasons as it did for the ancient Egyptians. And somewhere in the silence of the desert night, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the whispers of the past, the voices of scribes and priests, of farmers and craftsmen, of pharaohs and queens, all telling the same eternal story of a people who dared to dream of immortality and, in their own way, achieved it. The story of ancient Egypt is over, but its legacy is eternal. In every pyramid that reaches toward the sky, in every temple that honors the divine, in every work of art that captures beauty, in every act of preservation that honors the past, the spirit of ancient Egypt lives on. The pharaohs promised their people eternal life, and in a way, they delivered on that promise. Ancient Egypt is dead, but it will never die. It lives on in our memory, our imagination, and our endless fascination with a civilization that achieved greatness when the world was young and left us monuments that will endure until the end of time. And there, in the quiet darkness of your room, as the ancient stories fade into the gentle rhythm of your breathing, know that you too are part of this eternal tale. The same stars that guided the pyramid builders shine down on you tonight. The same human dreams that drove the pharaohs to build for eternity live on in your heart. Rest now, knowing that the wisdom of ages flows through your dreams, and that tomorrow you will wake as an heir to the greatest civilization the world has ever known. Sleep well, child of the Nile. Your story is written in the stars.